Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's workshop on developing a climate action plan for transportation infrastructure. My name is Joan Chaplick. I work with MIG and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's program. I appreciate everyone's patience logging in with Zoom. We're taking advantage of their security features to have a great program today. So before we get started, I just want to do a brief review of the agenda to let you know how you'll be participating. So you'll notice as we're starting that everyone is on mute. So, but once we get into the breakout rooms, you'll be able to participate fully. So in just a few moments, we will have some opening remarks, and that's going to be followed by a presentation on the investment framework for the Climate Action Plan transportation infrastructure. That'll be about 30 minutes, and we're going to ask you to hold your questions so that we can maximize the time we spend in small groups. Then we're going to take a short break, and you're going to be assigned to a Zoom breakout session. There's going to be 3 sessions with 3 different topics. We've sent the topics out to you in advance, and in between each breakout session, we'll have a short break, and we're also going to mix up the groups a little bit. You have a facilitator and a recorder in each session, and you also have some agency representatives who can answer questions. So that's how we'll be spending the bulk of our time. After the 3 breakout sessions, we'll take another short break, and we're going to prepare a summary of what we've heard, the highlights from the 14 different breakout groups that we have scheduled today. That'll be followed by next steps and a wrap-up, and that's going to take us right through noon, which is the time we expect to be finished. So that's our preview, and with that, I'd like to get us started and introduce Darwin Musavi, the Deputy Secretary for Environmental Policy and Housing Coordination with CalSTA.
Great, thank you so much, Joan, for that introduction to the workshop, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We're very excited to have you all participating in our workshop to help develop the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure. Many of you have been involved in this effort, know this as the Executive Order N1919 Action Plan effort. We're doing a bit of rebranding now that we have a new Executive Order, EO 7920, that just came out a month ago, aimed at the same outcomes. So we're now calling this effort the CAPTI effort. So thank you everyone for attending this morning, and I will turn it over to Secretary Kim to do some opening remarks before we get going with our presentation.
Thank you very much, Darwin, and good morning, everybody. I was not going to start with this, especially since my team strongly discouraged me from going down this road, especially since these are turbulent times. The topic of today's meeting is pretty darn serious, but we cannot escape the fact that Halloween is only a week and a half away. And I just think we need to have some fun with it for at least a little moment. So I'm going to start with a couple questions for all of you. How do vampires get around on Halloween?
How do they get around?
On blood vessels. See, that's a transportation-related Halloween joke. Why did the ghost go into the bar? For the booze. Last one, I promise you. Why do skeletons have low self-esteem? Because they have nobody to love. I know, very corny. You're rolling your eyes, I'm sure, or muttering under your breath, but now we're in the Halloween spirit, and now we can start on something that's weighing on everyone's minds. But before I get to that, I really do hope that as we approach Halloween, you celebrate safely and appropriately. If you have kids, I hope you have a great time. And if you don't have kids, you can still enjoy it within a safe context. So back to regular order. It's great to have so many of you join us for this very important public workshop on the Governor's Climate Change Executive Order, including the most recent one, and especially to get your feedback on a draft Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure, also known as CAPTI, as Darwin mentioned. I want to begin by acknowledging the many state agencies that have been working with us to develop the draft plan. It is truly a collaborative effort within the administration, led by CalSTA, but in coordination with Caltrans, CTC, Office of Planning and Research, GoBiz, Strategic Growth Council, Housing and Community Development, and CARB, and we've also gotten input from other departments. So a big shout out to all of our state partners for their leadership and contributions to this effort. As all of you know, we are in the middle of a climate crisis, a climate emergency, as the governor has said on many occasions. It has come at us much faster and earlier than expected, and the effects of climate change are clearly evident, and they're all around us, wildfires being one recent example. In fact, just this year from fires alone, we have spent more than $100 million in emergency damage orders on the state highway system, and that number is likely to go up even further. The governor is focused on strengthening our resilience in the face of these increasingly severe climate impacts, and also focused on aggressively bringing down carbon emissions. And all of us in transportation need to be part of the solution. Now, you've heard the data point, more than 50% of California's greenhouse gas emissions comes from the transportation sector. If we're going to make progress in addressing climate change, there really is no time to waste. We've got to tackle this now, not 2 years or 5 years down the road. And it'll take bold action to get us there, and that is reflected in the governor's recent executive order N7920, which was released on September 23rd. The executive order puts California on a path to a zero-emission future. It requires all new cars sold in the state to be zero-emission by 2035, and sales of commercial trucks to be zero-emission by 2045. These are critically important steps in reducing transportation emissions. But even under the most aggressive scenarios for adoption of zero-emission vehicles, as well as a transition to clean fuels, the fact is that we cannot meet our climate goals by relying exclusively on vehicle technologies alone. It's got to be combined with efforts to reduce our dependence on driving and reduce VMT. So this brings us to the current effort and why Executive Order N7920 reiterates the critically important message of Executive Order N1919. And just to refresh your memory, N1919 directs CalSTA to leverage discretionary state transportation funds to reduce GHG emissions in the transportation sector. It also highlights the importance of walking, biking, and transit, and focuses on projects that do not increase passenger vehicle travel. The main point is that without reducing driving in California, we will not meet our climate goals. Now, to be sure, a lot of progress has been made in planning and thinking about these issues over the past decade, but the results are still outstanding. We've got to redouble our efforts to make sure that all Californians have multiple travel choices. That means creating competitive and sustainable options that get people where they need to go in a timely, convenient, seamless, and affordable manner. It also means we need to move away from the long-standing practice of giving a competitive advantage to the automobile when it comes to selecting and funding projects. Instead, the mission is to find ways to prioritize projects that create more travel choices over projects that encourage and accommodate more driving. For decades, we have prioritized the movement of vehicles over the movement of people, and this has widened inequities throughout the state. It has resulted in car ownership becoming an expensive necessity for many Californians in low-income and disadvantaged communities. Also, as we address how Californians travel, we also need to take a hard look at our freight system, how to move goods in a sustainable way that strengthens the economy and reduces the environmental burden on disadvantaged communities. We will lay the foundation for a zero-emission freight system that will serve our state and nation, while at the same time making sure that disadvantaged communities of color, which have long suffered disproportionately from severe air quality and poor health impacts, can experience far better outcomes. The current moment has brought us so many complex challenges, but it also presents a huge opportunity to reimagine the future, a better future for the transportation sector. Think about the past 7 months. People have been dramatically changing their travel behavior in the face of a global pandemic. We've also been reckoning with systemic and institutional racism that has existed for so long. And as we look to economic recovery, can we do it in a way that will reduce the deep inequities that exist? These are clearly daunting times, but this is precisely the right moment to have these kinds of conversations. And I also want to emphasize that these ambitious goals will be considered pragmatically, and that we can do so within our existing framework and transportation vision. So for example, our commitment to a fix-it-first approach, as reflected in SB1, will continue. I want to assure you of that. Maintaining state of good repair of our highways, roads, and bridges is of the utmost importance to the governor, and that will continue. It's also worth mentioning that the principle of fix-it-first means that we need to take a thoughtful approach when it comes to expanding the existing system. I think it's important to ask the question, if we invest in capital projects that ultimately increase long-term maintenance costs without advancing climate and equity goals, is that a trade-off worth making? Something to ponder. What will it take for all of us to think in a creative, pragmatic, and holistic manner when it comes to investing in projects that provide clean, safe, and equitable multimodal options for all Californians? That's the challenge before us. But I want to emphasize that we cannot do this alone. We are excited to partner with all of you to come up with a new and better approach to transportation planning, programming, and project delivery that will enable us to achieve ambitious and critical goals. We at CalSTA have spent the past year conducting quite a bit of outreach, and we're going to continue to engage with partners and stakeholders to develop an action plan that will prioritize future state transportation dollars for existing programs or future funding opportunities. Today, we want to give all of you an opportunity to hear about the feedback we've received, as well as hear a bit more about potential approaches to move this effort forward. And most importantly, we want to create space for dialogue that will help inform the draft plan that will be released in early 2021 with your help. There's a lot of work ahead for all of us, and we're glad you're a part of this important effort. And so with that, thank you so much again for being here today. Greatly appreciate your participation. And now I'll turn it back over to Darwin.
Great, thank you so much, Secretary Kim, for those inspiring remarks and motivating remarks. Obviously, we have a lot of work here ahead of us and excited for the conversations to come today. But I will get us started off here with a bit of a presentation, doing a bit of an overview of the work we've done so far and setting the stage for the breakout discussions to come later today. So we'll start off with talking about why we're doing this action plan. Obviously, Secretary Kim spoke about this. Next slide, please. But as Secretary Kim mentioned, the greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector in California account for over 50% of all emissions. Next slide, please. And as we know, as Secretary Kim also mentioned, clean vehicles and clean fuels alone are not going to get us there. The mobile source strategy that CARB has put out clearly identifies the need for a vehicle use reduction and overall reduction in VMT as part of that overall solution. And so that piece, which is critical to this effort, when we talk about transportation infrastructure and mode choice is really what this effort is about. Next slide. And, in addition to the general kind of framing as to why this effort is important, we have a directive from the governor to do something about it. So, many of you know by now, Executive Order N1919, which came out last September around Climate Week in 2019, specifically asked CalSTA to leverage transportation spending to help meet our state climate goals. It asked us to do so, or to do 5 distinct things. One, to align our planning and programming objectives with the California Climate Change Scoping Plan. It asked us to reduce VMT by directing investments in a way that support infill development, especially housing near jobs. To tackle congestion reduction through innovative strategies that encourage people to shift from cars to other modes of travel, such as pricing strategies and other demand management strategies, and to fund infrastructure that encourages transit use, walking, and biking. I think most importantly, our charge is to do all of this while mitigating for increases in transportation costs incurred to low-income Californians to not further the inequities that Secretary Kim spoke about. Next slide. And so when we talk about leveraging funds, the executive order specifically calls out $5 billion of transportation infrastructure funding. And the makeup of those dollars is listed here. These are programs that many of you are familiar with, where the state or state agencies play a role in either scoping, recommending, or selecting projects. So, we're talking about discretionary competitive programs where the state plays a role. This effort is not about the larger set of SB1 dollars beyond these programs that are given out formulaically to regions or locals. This effort doesn't touch on regional planning efforts that are independent of state funds. So I think it's important to kind of keep these programs in mind as we have discussion. As we'll talk about a little bit later, it's not just about programming, but the outcomes that we're aiming for are really about where is our money going with these programs. And one thing I guess I'll note while we're here is that although these programs are statutorily bound to specific uses, there's many opportunities within each of these to further align them with our climate change goals. It's also important to note that many of these programs already are fairly aligned with our climate change goals. So it's not like we're starting from scratch. We have a lot of groundwork that's already happened and a great foundation to build on. Next slide, please. Then came along Executive Order N7920. This is the new climate executive order around zero-emission vehicles that came out just last month that calls on us to have all sale of new vehicles, light-duty vehicles by 2035 be a zero-emission vehicle in the state, and heavy-duty by 2045, amongst other pieces. One piece of this executive order is that it directly calls out the need to expand clean transportation options as outlined in EO N1919. So it connects the two pieces of work together, reminding us that the zero emission vehicle goals alone won't get us to our climate target. Next slide. And so as we implement these two executive orders, we're doing so within the existing frame of our transportation goals. So many of you may be aware of the California Transportation Plan 2050, which is now out in draft form. These are the 8 goals outlined there. Our effort here, the CAPTI effort, is really intended to implement the executive orders in a way that furthers these CTP goals. And so, I think the existing framework here allows us to do so. Next slide. So that was a bit of an overview on kind of setting the stage as to why CAPTI exists and why it's important, but I'll turn it over now to Deputy Secretary for Transportation Planning, Avital Barnea from our team, to talk a little bit about the work we've done to date on developing the plan.
Thank you so much, Darwin, and good morning, everybody. Following the release of EON 1919 last year, as you can see here on this slide, CALSTA conveyed an interagency working group, including staff from Caltrans, the California Transportation Commission, Cal EPA, the California Air Resources Board, the Department of Finance, the Department of Housing and Community Development, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, the Strategic Growth Council, and the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. We've had quite a large interagency group involved in the EON 1919 effort since last year. This working group jointly drafted 10 investment strategies to reduce emissions and mitigate the impacts of climate change. And then between April and June of this year, CALSTA engaged over 200 public agency and advocacy stakeholders, including many of you, and held individual meetings with several of these groups to get your input on the investment strategies. Then in July, we sent the 10 investment strategies, which were shaped by stakeholder feedback, to our stakeholder mailing list, and we asked for your feedback via a survey. That survey closed in August, and we received 79 responses, as well as several letters from stakeholders with additional feedback to augment your survey responses. Stakeholder responses also included over 200 action item ideas to implement the executive order, as well as over 150 additional comments and suggestions regarding our investment framework and approach. Then, just last month, on September 23rd, Governor Newsom signed Executive Order N7920, which puts a spotlight on the importance of current activities tied to EON 1919 and establishes a date certain to finalize a plan for actions. So as the interagency group completed our initial review of the action item ideas, we revised the draft investment framework and have included the updated version as part of today's workshop materials, which is the PDF you should have received via email. We look forward to discussing that document with you and our action item work during the breakout sessions. Following this workshop, our next public engagement on the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure will be a presentation at the joint CARB CTC HCB virtual meeting on November 4th. CALSTA will provide an overview of the CAPTI work so far at that meeting and also preview examples of action items for discussion by the joint meeting body. There will also be opportunity for public comment at that meeting. We will take comments from today's workshop as well as the November 4th joint meeting and further refine the action plan. We are aiming to release the the draft action plan for public comment in early 2021, and we will also hold another stakeholder workshop after the release of that draft plan. We are then finally targeting to release the action plan in spring 2021 in time to present it at the joint CARB CTC HCB meeting next spring. Next slide, please. So what we've heard through ongoing stakeholder feedback, we have heard several areas of interest from you. As you can see here on the slide, that includes making improvements to ensure meaningful community engagement and participation in project planning and decision making, advancing an intersectional and cross-sectoral approach to transportation investments, aligning funding program requirements to match climate goals, rewarding localities through incentives and recognizing best practices, continuing to invest in active transportation, exploring new or supplemental funding streams, and exploring the role of CEQA in moving along action on climate change. Next slide, please. We've also heard that there are areas where we need to be careful in this work, and that includes creating a balance between local needs and standardized approaches, ensuring all areas of the state can benefit from any realignment of funding, and considering how to address local commitments and priorities that may not align with state priorities. These areas of interest, as well as the points of caution, will be at the forefront of our minds as we work to refine the list of potential actions that will be included in the draft action plan. Next slide, please. So all of this feedback has influenced the draft investment framework, which was developed within the Fix-It-First approach and centers around 10 strategies that I will cover on the next couple slides and are also explained in more detail in the PDF provided for this meeting. The investment framework sets the stage for what our transportation investments should look like in order to achieve the goals of Executive Orders N1919 and N7920, and the actions in the plan will help make that framework a reality. Next slide, please. So 3 of these investment strategies were highlighted in Executive Order N7920, and they are focused around expanding clean transportation options. Those include building an integrated statewide rail and transit network to provide seamless, affordable, multimodal travel options for all, incorporating safe and accessible infrastructure into projects to support bicycle and pedestrian options, particularly in low-income and disadvantaged communities, and supporting light, medium, and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles and infrastructure. Next slide, please. The other 7 strategies that you see here will help us meet the objectives of EO N1919, and as we have heard from stakeholder feedback, these are important to meet our climate goals, and this includes reducing public health harms and maximizing benefits to disproportionately impacted disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, and communities of color, making safety improvements to reduce fatalities and severe injuries of all users towards zero, assessing physical climate risk, promoting projects that do not increase passenger vehicle travel, promoting compact infill development while protecting residents and businesses from displacement, developing a zero-emission freight transportation system, and protecting natural and working lands. There will be more opportunity to dive into these strategies during the breakout sessions, and more detail is included in the draft investment framework document. And with that, I would like to pass it back to Darwin to talk about the action items approach.
Great, thank you so much, Avital. Next slide, please. All right, so taking that framework that Avital laid out, now we can switch gears to discussing the action items that would help implement the framework. The framework is only as good as what we decide to do and what we decide to take action on. We're not, as mentioned earlier, this effort is not meant to take that framework and kind of redo the existing framework of SB1 and kind of mirror that investment framework. That's not the intent here. Our intent is to take that framework and then come up with various specific actions that can help move us in the direction of implementing it within the existing funding framework that exists through SB1 and our Fix-It-First approach. And so to do so, we really need to look at actions in planning, programming, project delivery, maintenance, and operations. And it really does take actions kind of across the spectrum to be able to make those types of changes. It's not, as I mentioned earlier, not just about programming. It really is about the pipeline of projects coming into programming and then the decisions made there on out. And so many, as I mentioned earlier, many changes are currently underway, but additional actions are needed, which is why this effort is happening. Next slide, please. So specifically, our action items approach includes looking at 5 different kind of categories and types of actions. One is actions that align planning investments with the CAPDI framework. So looking for opportunities within Caltrans planning where we could further align the outcomes of those planning efforts with the framework that we've put forward. Second would be updating program guidelines to strengthen alignment with the CAPDI framework and climate goals. So, I think this is the piece that people identify immediately, given that we are leading with that set of investments in the executive order. So this is your typical, how can we change program guidelines to get at some of these outcomes in project selection. Next, it's important for us to look at how do we improve existing agency processes and practices to remove barriers and accelerate climate action. So there could be places where we're already moving in the right direction, but there are some tweaks and changes to our process that could really help accelerate that action. Next, we are looking at some targeted places of where can we pursue authority for new initiatives. Are there new actions that don't exist today and new efforts that don't exist today that are really necessary to get us to our goals? But it's important for us to think about this within our current context and our current funding context. Lastly, supportive and coordinating actions led by other sectors critical to plan success. We need to acknowledge that we're not going to reduce the transportation emissions through transportation infrastructure alone. Transportation infrastructure is just one piece of a bigger puzzle of land use decisions and economic drivers and other things going on in our communities that are really necessary to get at some of these goals. So this action plan will help identify some of the supportive and coordinating actions necessary with other sectors. So as mentioned earlier, although some statutory changes might be needed through this effort, we are really looking to work within kind of existing frameworks and have this be driven by administrative actions, things that the administration can do within its existing statutory purview, but there may be some new statutory some efforts to change statute that come out of this as well. Now, to give folks a better sense of some of these actions, we've kind of compiled a set of examples, and these set of examples are exactly that. They're just a sampling of actions that we've heard from all of you as stakeholders. These specific actions were chosen a bit at random, but to give folks a set of diverse actions and to give you a sense of the different types of things that we're hearing from folks. So this is not in any ways an all-inclusive list, nor is it things that we've necessarily committed to including in the action plan, but to help spur some discussion, we've wanted to highlight some of those potential actions here today. So next slide, please. So the first of the example actions, we heard a lot from stakeholders around the need to really integrate climate adaptation and thinking about climate risk into our planning and project implementation. So a set of actions that can be taken around that would be to develop a climate risk assessment planning guide to help direct that work and inform that work. Developing an understanding of monetary risks and costs of climate inaction on transportation infrastructure is also a key area where we could take some actions. This would be, I think, a very important step in really being able to assess and plan for and know what types of resources we need to really tackle the changes that climate change will be bringing to our infrastructure and the risk associated with those weather events. Next slide. All right. So another type of action that we could consider around aligning state-sponsored transportation projects with this CAPTI framework is developing a strategic investment strategy or a tool that's data and performance driven. So this really gets at the role that Caltrans plays in project selection. You know, in the programs that we mentioned, many of those programs have local and regional transportation entities applying for funding, but Caltrans is also a huge applicant in some of those programs. And so for the Caltrans portion of those projects, an action like this would help make sure that the department is really looking at how it can advance this framework through data and performance-driven approaches when it decides what projects to nominate and support for funding in this program. Next slide. Another area we've heard a lot about from all of you is the need to really figure out VMT mitigation, given the recent adoption of new guidance for SB 743 implementation on transportation projects. I think this is an area, a key need that's been identified. Some actions we can take to support that would be to explore the creation of a statewide VMT mitigation bank to assist with 743 implementation. You know, another type of action that we've heard from folks that we could consider is exploring the creation of VMT mitigation set-asides within programs that fund highway capacity projects. So there's different ways to go about this. There could be multiple ways that we go about it at the same time. But overall, this is an area of need. Next slide. Right. Another area that we heard a lot about is roadway pricing, and particularly, you know, many of these efforts are going to be locally and regionally driven, but there was a big desire for the state to show some leadership in this space. You know, one thing we could do is to draft a California roadway pricing report for equity and sustainability that outlines legislative and administrative opportunities and barriers to implementation of various roadway pricing applications. So, you know, this wouldn't necessarily be the state taking any action towards implementing roadway pricing at a statewide level. Obviously, this would really be about, you know, how do we help local and regional governments kind of not go it alone and help identify you know, what they need from us to make those local and regional initiatives the reality. Next slide. All right. Obviously, at the forefront of everyone's mind in the pandemic when it comes to transportation is the future of transit, and you know, an effort that frankly, you know, we could even consider taking up sooner than the adoption of this effort is really looking at how do we better coordinate on transit recovery response. You know, this is happening in various pieces, and it's happening in various regions as well. But convening a statewide effort to help develop a coordinated federal fund to ask could be a potential opportunity. That's something that people were really interested in. Leveraging Cal ITP to encourage seamless, affordable, and accessible transit service as part of recovery efforts is something else that came up. Next slide. And finally, another example we wanted to share is around zero-emission freight investments. So one thing that we could do in this area is work with local and regional partners to develop a zero-emission freight project list to be included in the next project list for the California Freight Mobility Plan. I think having a real concerted effort around this could really help unlock a lot of potential around zero emission freight. We could also use existing interagency work groups to convene folks to deploy new strategies that improve efficiency and reduce carbon intensity of freight, encourage freight mode shift, as well as address the various land use issues related to freight issues. So having a specific place for discussion for a lot of these entities at the statewide level. There are existing freight advisory committees and efforts, but not kind of a one-stop shop for all these discussions. Right. Next slide. All right, and with that, so that concludes our initial presentation. And just this presentation really serves as helping set the stage for the breakout sessions that we're about to have right now. We thought it was important to share various ideas of what we've heard. Again, this workshop is really where we want to get input about where we should go. So these are just examples and ideas that we've heard from all of you, and would love to hear more from all of you today. So I will pass it back over to Joan to explain what happens next.
Okay, thank you, Darwin. So we're going to have a 5-minute break. Anna's going to reset the timer. That's going to be on the screen. And I just want to give you a little preview of how we'll be spending our time. So there's going to be a series of 3 breakout groups. You're going to be automatically and electronically sent into a breakout group. There'll be about 8 to 10 people. You have an MIG facilitator and note taker. We're neutral parties collecting input. There will also be some agency staff who may be available to answer some questions to help keep the discussion moving forward. The first question focuses on actions. And then we get to the second breakout. We'll be talking about equity considerations. And the third topic is promoting low VMT projects. And just to remind you that the 2 breakout sessions, equity and low VMT projects, that came out of the stakeholder engagement work. There was a survey conducted as part of that effort, and people were asked to identify the topics that they wanted to have additional conversation on. So that's how we've broken out the remaining time. So there'll be 3 30-minute sections with a break in between, and we'll be mixing up the groups a little bit. We'll also be following up with the PowerPoint. We're getting some questions about that, and we'll work with Darwin to see about making that available to participants after the meeting. So with that, we're going to start our 5-minute break. For those of you who should be in the Zoom room, please persist, and we'll get you into a breakout group. And when the timer finishes, when it goes down to 0, you're automatically going to be brought into a breakout group, and you're going to get a message about joining the breakout group. And you want to click that message where it says join. When you don't do that, it's kind of like you're hanging out in the hallway. So let's enjoy a 5-minute break, and then we'll start our first breakout discussion. I want to thank Darwin and Secretary Kim and Avital Barnea for excellent opening remarks and presentation to set the tone for our conversation. Thank you, and we'll be back in 5 minutes. Okay, everyone. So I want to thank everyone for excellent participation in the breakout groups. We're just going to take a moment here to transition the timer off the screen, and then Anna's going to pull up the summary PowerPoint. So while you have all been in the breakout groups, myself, Anna Padilla, and Joey Nielsen have been working to take the highlighted points and get them into a PowerPoint. We've done some editing, we've eliminated duplication. So if you don't see your exact words, we didn't miss it. We just haven't summarized it in this session, but we do have a full record of all of the notes that have been put in the breakout sessions. So none of your points will be lost. So with this, Anna, if we're we have a question about the live feed. It looks like it's back on. So Joey, if you could confirm that the live streaming is back on for this part of the session.
Hey Joan, I'm not sure if that link reset and started the stream back up, so we might have to have that set up through the YouTube with the Caltrans account, because that link that we were using,
Okay.
it was the link we used originally, but it didn't restart it when we restarted the stream.
Okay. So, well, we do have a recording of this. So if Tony can help us with that, we can get that restarted, and we can do the breakout summary so that we can finish on time. So Anna, if you're ready, I'd like to give everyone just a flavor of what we heard in the different groups. So our first group, Anna, if I could have the first slide. Okay, so in this one, again, we were focused on the actions that were most urgently needed. How do transportation needs change in response to the pandemic? It was a pretty big topic in terms of the actions, and we had a very wide range of responses. So if I could have the next slide. Funding came up a lot. Funding in a variety of forms, flexibility, paying for climate change, vulnerability assessments, comments related to pricing, funding for transit, and also that the state and federal government would need to be involved, providing more funds, allowing for repurposing of funds. There were comments about safety, safety being very important, especially as it relates to active transportation, traffic calming, and especially with more people out during this pandemic using their streets and walking and biking actively. The next slide. Collaboration was a big topic. So a lot of people are going to need to work together. Cities working on active transportation with guidance from the state, taking a holistic framework approach and doing this to make sure the most vulnerable populations are served. We want to have collaboration as it relates to land use, housing, and transportation groups and decision making working together. Collaborate on funding, and then also bring that together in terms of prioritization. So we want to make sure we get services to the most vulnerable populations, that through that prioritization, we can give the operators the flexibility that they need. We can prioritize how we repurpose road space and right-of-way to get more out of it. Next slide. The transit agencies need help. They're in survival mode. We need education. We also need campaigns to increase user confidence so that people understand that transit is safe, it's reliable, it will get you where you need. That it serves our most vulnerable populations. We want to make sure the operators have flexibility. Could we consider free or reduced transit fares? There could be partnerships with the business community in different places. Can there be incentives, whether it's alternative transportation like e-bikes? But overall, we need to restore confidence in the safety of travel, especially on transit. We want to look at the different types of agencies that are involved, rural, looking at long-term impacts on transportation. Telecommuting is a big topic that many people discussed. It can definitely help us achieve VMT reduction. We have to take equity into account. Many positions, especially for frontline workers, do not have telecommuting options. And then on the other front, broadband is a part of the telecommuting equation. If you don't have broadband and it's not available or accessible to you, your telecommuting options can be very limited. Let's go to the next slide. Let's consider fast-tracking projects that are in the planning phase and take a look at legacy projects. Then think about a faster transition of transit and goods movement vehicles, especially with a focus on zero emissions vehicles and autonomous electric vehicles. We have to look at urbanized and non-urbanized connectivity and the differences in policy and solutions that are going to get us there. We also want to look at aggressive investment in green infrastructure. That's part of the equation. Microtransit is another aspect that we need to take a look at, and especially as it's been impacted by COVID. And again, building confidence in the health and safety of transit. Next slide. Again, telecommuting, so we have the impact on VMT, but it's also changed where people are working. We have a lot more people working from their vacation homes, or they've moved to smaller communities, and that shifted where people are both living and working. When we look at reducing VMTs, we have a suggestion of relaxing state funding guidelines for projects that would reduce non-work VMT, look at ways to support alternative modes to decrease VMTs, especially to our downtown areas. We need to invest in non-motorized transportation infrastructure, so our active transportation infrastructure that it gets the resources it needs, and again, that we consider our land use practices and how we're integrating housing, jobs, and transportation. The next slide. So that's a quick summary of breakout session 1. Breakout session 2 focused on equity considerations. So the equity consideration discussion started, and we have our opening question here. And Anna, let's go to the summary points. Within the highlights, there was a big focus on community engagement. We need to do things differently. We have to look at who we're serving, what we're doing. We have to look at who we're trying to reach. Within our organization, we have to be intentional with our staff about anti-racism education and have discussions so people can truly understand equity issues. We want to make sure that we have direct representation and participation from key populations. We also want to provide language support so that non-English speakers can actively engage in these projects. We want to engage with the community early, so get out there during the planning process before decisions are made, especially before funding decisions are made. And again, consider how we can be intentionally anti-racist in our approach to community engagement. That was a comment that came up a few times. And then also supporting our community-based organizations, and especially those serving and located in disadvantaged communities. They can play an important role. And to make this possible, we want to prioritize funding for stakeholder engagement, especially to help us reach underrepresented communities. Next slide. We had comments about on the equity front related to flexibility, that for serving our vulnerable populations, our operators needed flexibility to determine how existing resources are used, how they can maximize ridership. Do we have the flexibility to shift plans once funding has been secured? So maybe in response to current community input, to adjust some of our decision making, and to overall create integrated strategies and programs that are specific to achieving equity outcomes. We want to scale our transportation funding and projects to different size communities in both urban and rural regions. And we want to guide the development of clean mobility options. This would occur through community input, needs assessment, and taking into a local account. Then we had a couple of comments about rail, that the state rail plan would provide increased options for transportation, especially in rural areas. Our next slide. We want to consider moving away solely from a focus on fare box recovery, and then look at development and how development is affecting our communities. We have low-income residents forced out of urban centers. We have rising prices, and people are living in areas underserved by transportation. affordable housing construction. We need to accelerate this so people can afford to live near where they work and go to school. And then look at integrated strategies for means-based tolling, looking at bike lanes, e-bikes, regulatory policies on freight traffic, especially associated with online orders. So there's some very far-reaching activities that we can all do to make progress on the equity front. Our next slide. We had a suggestion of revisiting Cal EnviroScreen, especially as it relates to how rural communities are assessed using that metric. Then funding was an issue, especially as it related to access to funding and then removing barriers, especially some of the smaller community-based organizations. The reimbursement process was beyond their capacity. So can we make things easier for them to participate in these funding processes? We want to look at hiring people from the communities where projects are being limited, and take a look at and stop funding projects that are going to have detrimental impacts. So if this is being brought to our attention by representatives from these communities, can we influence and change our decision making? We have comments about linking electrification and VMT reduction, how they can work together without being at odds, so that you have cleaner transportation. And then some comments on congestion pricing and making sure that it's implemented in a way that it caters to the needs of low-income communities. Next slide. Some comments on defining equity, making sure that we're clear on what it means, especially relating to specific populations and communities. Then along with that, rethink the tools we're currently using. Are they helping us achieve our measures? And then through it all, look at greater collaboration, and this is a place where the state can play a greater role. There seem to be a lot of silos, and maybe state direction can help get people working together. Some additional comments on workforce development, whether it be training programs or phasing out fossil fuel jobs and easing that transition, and then looking at turning over the transportation fleet to zero emissions so that we're only working with clean vehicles. Our next slide. Okay, now we are moving on to breakout session 3, which was a group for promoting low VMT projects. So our next slide has the question the group was asked to discuss, and this one should be fresh in your mind. And so let's go to some of the suggestions and ideas that came out of this. So getting support for local jurisdictions as it relates to SB 743 implementation, looking at a mitigation bank on a statewide level and learning from best practices, what works and what didn't. Consider relaxing CEQA requirements or changing project guidelines to prioritize VMT reduction. Look at strengthening requirements, then different partnerships, getting different people working together on transportation solutions, changing project guidelines, and looking at providing alternatives for first and last mile trips and trips that are close to home. Our next slide. Look at user comfort and safety in these projects, and have a clear story to tell that helps people understand, especially decision makers, all the benefits of these activities. Especially large projects, what are the benefits to low-income communities, and making sure that we don't solely focus on VMT reduction, but that we also talk about some of the other benefits that are achieved. Implement streamlining options, technical assistance, and legislation to help make this possible. And let's go to our next slide. Let's delineate targeted funding, improve the ability for locals, state, and regional authorities to collaborate and communicate on projects, especially in real time. Look at developing appropriate messaging, shape the programs to be to meet both state criteria and local or regional needs. And then let's look at main streets as highways, especially in rural areas. Your main street is your rural state highway. So how do we make this so they're not just dividers? We have communities that want improvements to be in their community, not just along the highway. And we had a suggestion of a collaborative workbook on highway and main street integration. Next slide. Just a few more ideas. Improving the ease of taking rail to replace an automobile commute. Socializing the VMT discussion so that the state legislature hears the case. Again, other comments about changing eligibility requirements and scoring criteria, especially as it relates to rural areas. Requiring schools to work with local entities on their location before they're built in the middle of nowhere in a place that doesn't that creates sprawl and a lot of traffic. Look at mobilizing partnerships to work across the region together. And you have more people getting outside and staying in rural places. And this is going to impact the VMT conversation. So let's see if we can provide options for new travel patterns in these areas. Okay, Anna, do we have any more slides for our summary? Oh, okay, breakout session 3. So, again, collaboration, shared responsibility, flexible funding. So a lot of these are duplicates of some of the comments that we heard before. Just a quick flavor of what we've heard from the different breakout groups. And Anna, any final slides for our summary? Okay, so thank you for the whirlwind information and summary. It sounds like the groups had a lot of exciting discussions. For us, I think that was the fastest PowerPoint ever created. The last slides could use a little bit more editing, so we'll clean that up and things will be part of the final record. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Darwin for some closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Joan, for that quick overview. I'm impressed at how quickly you all were able to pull that all together and give us a sense of what was spoken about in the sessions. So very much appreciate all your work and the MIG team. If we can go to the next slide here, I can go through some next steps for everyone. So before we let you all go, I know we're at 12, so I'll make this quick, but just wanted to walk through some next steps. So the recording of this workshop and a report out from the breakout sessions will be provided in a follow-up via email. We'll try to get that to you all as soon as possible. We just want to make sure that the notes and everything are kind of cleaned up and that we have everything captured before we send that out. For those of you who tuned in here today, thank you so much for participating. We welcome you to join us again on November 4th at the joint CTC CARB HCV meeting, where there'll be a follow-up presentation and discussion about this topic. The information from this workshop and the joint meeting will help inform our upcoming draft of the action plan, which will be drafted later this fall into winter and released in early 2021. Again, I think Joan mentioned this, or I mentioned this at the outset, that there'll be an additional workshop once that draft is released, followed by comment period to get your input on that draft action plan before the final plan is released in spring of next year. So I just really quick want to thank everyone again for your participation. I think we had, just looking at the report out, there's a lot of great points and a lot of meaningful discussion seems to have occurred in the breakout. So I'm very excited to dive in with all of that, with the team here at CalSTA and our interagency partners. Thanks to the interagency team for helping pull this off, and to Meg for your facilitation, and to the rest of you for your participation. Have a good rest of your day. And with that, we conclude the workshop.